Friends of Islam, this time the Islamic faith is back before you to share Islamic information. I hope it inspires your activities today. And don't forget to click the subscribe button and activate the bell button notifications so you don't miss the latest news from the Islamic Faith channel. The Chinese government is shocked. An ancient tomb has been found hidden behind the country's legendary wall. But what has astonished the world is that this tomb is thought to belong to a prophet who is not recorded in any holy book. Who is he really, and why is his body in an area that has never been known as a prophetic land? The year 2025 recorded an event that shook China, even the world. It all started with an unexpected incident. Part of the Great Wall of China collapsed due to a major landslide that hit the northern region of Hebei province. The local government initially considered this incident to be just an ordinary natural disaster. Evacuation teams and archaeologists were immediately deployed to secure the ruins area, especially since the location is an important part of the nation's historical heritage. However, when the excavation process began, archaeologists found something unusual. Behind a pile of large rocks and lumpy soil, they found a large stone structure resembling a cave entrance. The door was not random. There were strange and unusual carvings for ancient Chinese architectural styles. The shape of the calligraphy and symbols on the stone did not match the local culture. When the linguists began to examine the inscriptions, they were surprised to find that the inscriptions were in classical Arabic. This was puzzling. Why would there be Arabic inscriptions embedded in the Great Wall of China? History has documented connections between the Islamic world and China, but never on this scale. After several days of preliminary cleaning and research, the research team announced that they had discovered an ancient underground chamber. The chamber was quite large, filled with age-old stone ornaments, and in the center was a large tombstone with Arabic writing that was still quite legible. The inscription read, "The chosen servant of God, the messenger of messengers, has returned to him. He was known by his people as a righteous person, patient, and never associated partners with Allah." At the bottom of the tombstone, the name was written in Arabic, Zulkifli or Zulfel. This news immediately spread to the center of government in Beijing. A joint team consisting of national archaeologists, historians, and officials from the Ministry of Culture and Heritage went directly to the location. The government initially tried to keep this discovery a secret for fear of causing unrest. But as can be predicted, this information leaked to the public. A member of the excavation team who secretly recorded a short video of the tomb location uploaded it to the internet. The video showed the tombstone surrounded by old stones with Arabic calligraphy, as well as confused researchers who were having serious discussions at the location. This video exploded within hours. Social media platforms in China and internationally were full of speculation. The hashtag Ayon Nabi di Sina became a trend in various parts of the world. Millions of people talked about it, both Muslims and non-Muslims. Historians from various countries have given their opinions. Some are skeptical, others consider this a great moment in the history of Islam in the world. The most surprising thing was the reaction of the Chinese people themselves. People began to come to the site, even from distant provinces. They wanted to see firsthand what was happening. Many of them were not Muslims, but curiosity brought them there. Some even said that they felt goosebumps when standing in front of the tomb. Some said they felt peaceful. Others said they were called by something inexplicable. On the other hand, the Muslim community in China, which had been living under oppression for so long, felt touched and at the same time protected. This discovery reinforced for them that the teachings they believed in had a deep historical trace, even in a land so far from the center of the Islamic world. Within weeks, thousands of Muslims from various countries began to arrive. The Chinese government finally could not hide this information any longer. They held a press conference and officially admitted that they had found a very old tomb with characteristics of Islamic culture. They have not stated with certainty that it is the tomb of a prophet, but call it the tomb of a holy figure from the Middle East who is thought to have come to China at a very early time. However, among Muslims, it did not take long to connect the name Zulkifli, written on the tombstone, with the prophet Zulkifli, one of the prophets mentioned in the Quran. Some scholars from the Middle East, Turkey, and Indonesia have also stated that this is most likely his tomb. Moreover, history records that the prophet Zulkifli was known as a very patient prophet, and according to some narrations, he died in an area far from Palestine, although it is not specifically mentioned where. The situation at the tomb site has now changed drastically. The Chinese government was forced to temporarily close the area due to the extraordinary surge in visitors. However, that did not stop Muslims from coming, even if only to stand at a distance and pray. Many cried, many prostrated in gratitude. Interestingly, after this incident, there was a sharp increase in Chinese people's interest in Islam. Islamic information centers in Beijing, Guangzhou, and Urumqi began to be filled with people who wanted to know more. They began to ask, who is the prophet Zulkifli? What did he teach? And why is his tomb in Chinese soil? Not a few also decided to declare their faith. In the first month since this news broke, more than 3,000 Chinese people were recorded as openly declaring themselves to Islam. In fact, some came from academics, businessmen, and local government officials. This phenomenon continues to spread. International media began to highlight how Islam is reviving in China, not because of massive preaching, but because of an incident that cannot be explained by ordinary logic. Islamic figures call this a sign of Allah's greatness that was deliberately shown at a time when the world was in a crisis of faith and identity. The discovery of the tomb believed to belong to the prophet Zulkifli began to have a chain effect. The Chinese government initially hoped that the situation would calm down by closing access to the location and limiting information. But what happened was the opposite. Pressure from the world community, especially from Muslim-majority countries, continued to increase. Many urged that the site be opened for international research and maintained professionally as an important historical site for humanity. In the midst of this pressure, the Chinese government finally made a surprising decision. They opened cooperation with archaeologists and historians from abroad, especially from the Middle East and Southeast Asia. Delegates from Egypt, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, and Pakistan were directly invited to research the tomb with the Chinese team. This step was considered an effort to calm world opinion while securing diplomatic relations. When the international team arrived at the location, research immediately began intensively. They brought modern equipment, soil scanners, 3D imaging technology, and carbon analysis tools to examine the age of the tombstones and objects found around them. From the initial results, the tombstone and the crypt are estimated to be more than 2,090 years old, older than the Qin dynasty that built the Great Wall of China. What made them stunned was the conformity of the information from the tombstone with the story of the prophet Zulkifli in several classical Islamic sources. The names carved on the side of the stone refer to previous generations known in the tradition of the descendants of the prophets. One piece of calligraphy reads, "I am a servant of the children of Israel, promised patience, and I hold it until the end." In addition, an old scroll was found that was almost destroyed. With the help of advanced technology, some parts of the text were read. The text was not in Arabic or Chinese, but rather a kind of ancient Aramaic dialect, a language also used by ancient Jews in the Middle East. The scroll appears to be a record of the followers of the prophet Zulkifli, written shortly before or after his death. One translation reads, "We fled from destruction in the west and walked towards the rising sun until we found a peaceful valley guarded by high walls." This sentence led some researchers to suspect that the prophet Zulkifli and his followers fled from a major conflict and eventually settled in the Far Eastern region now known as North China. Outside the tomb site, researchers began looking for supporting evidence in the surrounding area. It turned out that not far from the tomb site, there was a remote village inhabited by a small community that claimed to have origins from the far west. They had hereditary traditions that were unusual for Chinese culture. One of their traditions was fasting from sunrise to sunset and worshiping one formless god. They did not mention the name of Allah due to language limitations, but in their rituals, the terms used had roots close to Hebrew and Arabic. A village elder said that their ancestors were people who came from the desert, bringing teachings to live simply, patiently, and not worship idols. These teachings, surprisingly, were very similar to the values of monotheism in Islam. This discovery shocked the academic world. Universities and historical institutions are racing to publish scientific papers, reanalyze the migration maps of the prophets, and compare biblical stories with discovered artifacts. The theory that some prophets had traveled as far as East Asia began to receive serious attention. Discoveries emerged everywhere. The topic of Prophet Zulkifli went viral on digital platforms, attracting millions of viewers from all over the world. Many began to relearn the stories of the prophets in Islam, including those who had previously had no interest in religious topics. Not a few non-Muslims also admitted that they had become interested in Islam since this discovery. One Chinese public figure, an influential celebrity, openly expressed his interest in Islamic teachings after visiting the tomb. He said that when he was near the tombstone, he felt peaceful and had goosebumps. A few weeks later, he uploaded a short video showing himself reciting the 2 sentences of the Shahada. The video went viral and touched millions of people. This domino effect created a new social atmosphere in China. Discussions about Islam are no longer considered taboo in public spaces. Some schools have even begun to include lessons on the history of world religions more openly. Although there is still a lot of political pressure, voices calling for tolerance and openness are getting stronger. However, not everyone is happy with this change. Some ultra-nationalists began to spread conspiracy theories that the discovery of the tomb was engineered by foreigners. They accused Islamic countries of trying to infiltrate their influence through historical channels. However, these accusations were not supported by strong evidence, and the public became even more curious to find out the truth for themselves. The Chinese government finally formed a special team tasked with guarding the tomb site and monitoring the flow of tourists and researchers. They also built a small museum not far from the location to accommodate archaeological findings and present information in a neutral manner. But one thing they could not control was the change in people's perspectives. What was initially considered ordinary ruins turned out to be the beginning of a new chapter in human history, not just about archaeology, but about identity, beliefs, and the spiritual connection between the past and the present. And now a big question is starting to arise. Was Prophet Zulkifli the only one who ever set foot in the Far East? Or were there other prophets who also left their mark in places we never expected before? After the tomb believed to belong to the prophet Zulkifli was discovered, a joint research team from various countries began to focus their research on one big question: how could a prophet of the children of Israel reach such a distant region in East Asia? There are no official historical records from ancient Chinese civilization that directly mention the arrival of foreigners who brought the teachings of monotheism. However, several ancient artifacts and local records that were previously ignored are now beginning to be re-examined. One of the historians from Turkey, Dr. Ayhan Selçuk, brought up an interesting finding from an ancient dynasty called Zhao. In one of the ancient manuscripts stored in a secret library in Chengdu, there is a story about a wise man from the West who lives behind a wall and teaches patience to the poor. The writing does not mention a name, but his characteristics and time span match the period estimated to be the life of the prophet Zulkifli. Dr. Ayhan even pointed out that in the story, the wise man lives in the quiet valley with a small group of followers and is known to like to worship at night and avoid violence. Meanwhile, a research team from Indonesia, led by Professor Ahmad Rizki, you can change the name as needed, found similarities in this migration pattern with the story of the spread of Islamic teachings carried out by the saints. He argued that if the saints could penetrate the Nusantara region with different cultures and languages, then it is not impossible for a persistent prophet who was given a task by God to penetrate the territory of China in his escape from oppression. At the tomb site, further excavations uncovered more evidence. A building structure was found that resembled a small house of worship. Interestingly, the walls of the building faced west, towards Mecca. Although this building structure is thought to have been built long before the time of the Prophet Muhammad, this direction of the Qibla is strong evidence of the existence of a monotheistic tradition that was known earlier in the region. Inside the building, there is a symbolic carving in the form of a palm facing upwards. In many Semitic cultures, this is a symbol of submission to God. The most interesting thing is the discovery of a flat stone inscribed with mixed script. In the middle, it is written in Hebrew-like letters. He was never angry and never betrayed his promise to God. Experts believe that this inscription refers to the character of the prophet Zulkifli, who was known as a patient and faithful person, as mentioned in the Quran. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in China began to change. Local people, especially in the area around the site, began to take a serious interest in studying Islam. Some communities that had previously considered the tomb as just another historical site began to treat it with more respect. They cleaned the surrounding area, created safe paths, and even set up a small information center for tourists. The Chinese government, initially skeptical, began to realize that it could not continue to be defensive. Too much international attention was focused on the discovery. In addition, the number of tourists visiting the area increased sharply. Hotels and restaurants were suddenly full, the local economy grew rapidly, and the government began to see this as a potential religious tourism opportunity. However, there were also those who felt threatened. Some academics in China questioned the veracity of the findings and claimed that the research was too religiously biased. They urged that a more neutral approach be taken to review it. However, each time this was attempted, new evidence only strengthened the possibility that the tomb did indeed belong to a great figure from the Western region. Outside China, the Muslim world reacted enthusiastically. In mosques and Islamic schools, the story of the prophet Zulkifli was taught again with renewed zeal. Many religious teachers and ustaz, Islamic teachers, linked the discovery as a faith booster and proof that the history of the prophets is vast, perhaps not yet fully revealed. One of the most touching reactions came from Yemen. An elderly cleric named Sheikh Magdisi delivered a Friday sermon to thousands of worshippers. In his sermon, he said, "If Zulkifli really reached the ends of the Eastern world, then we, Muslims, must also believe that the preaching and light of truth knows no boundaries." This is a reminder that the prophets are global role models, not just the property of one nation or one place. Several Muslim countries have even begun formal cooperation with China to develop the site as a center for research into early Islamic civilization. Egypt's Al-Azhar University sent a special team to focus on the study of ancient manuscripts. Meanwhile, the Islamic University of Medina has opened a student exchange program with campuses in Beijing and Xi'an. Amidst all this excitement, an important question arose from some Muslims. If this is really the tomb of a prophet, how should we behave? Is it permissible to visit it like a tourist attraction? Aren't we worried that it will fall into excessive glorification? These questions sparked serious discussions among scholars. The majority agreed that, if done with the intention of learning history and strengthening faith, visiting such tombs is permissible. However, they also reminded Muslims not to get caught up in rituals that deviate from Islamic teachings, such as begging or asking for blessings from the tomb. Some scholars even saw this as a sign of the times, not in the sense that the apocalypse is near, but rather the revival of the spirit of Muslims to trace their historical roots. So far, many have focused too much on the caliphate and ignored the stories of the prophets who spread to various regions of the world. Shortly after that, the Chinese government held an international symposium on the theme, Traces of Monotheistic Civilization in the Far East. At the event, figures from various religions were invited to engage in dialogue, exchange views, and discuss the importance of intercultural tolerance. The symposium was proof that, from an ancient tomb that was almost forgotten, the world could be invited to sit together and find common ground. That night, the sky around the tomb looked calm. The light of small lamps illuminated the path to the tombstone that was now tightly guarded. In the distance, the voices of village children could be heard chanting verses of the Quran that they had learned from the volunteers who had begun to arrive. And amidst all the changes, one thing became clear: history never dies. It is just waiting for the time to be rediscovered. And when that time comes, it will speak louder than anything ever written in textbooks. After the world's attention was drawn to the discovery of a mysterious tomb behind the Great Wall of China, the world of archaeology and religious science entered a new phase. This time, the focus was not only on the tomb itself, but also on the possibility of other traces of a civilization or community founded by the prophet who is believed to be Zulkifli. The research team began mapping an area with a radius of up to tens of kilometers from the tomb site to look for further clues. In a small village south of the tomb site, locals showed the research team a cave that had been considered a holy place for hundreds of years. No one knows for sure who first lived there, but according to the story passed down from generation to generation, it was once a place of meditation for someone from afar who taught moral teachings very different from those of their ancestors at that time. The cave is very simple, but on its walls there are amazing carvings. Not ancient Chinese art, but typical Middle Eastern patterns. Date palms, camel images, and the five-pointed star symbol often found in early Islamic artifacts. In the middle of the cave, there is a large stone that looks like a seat or a place for prayer. The seat is facing west. When researchers brought in a ground scanner and detected hidden layers beneath the cave, they found charred wood remains, sacrificial animal bones, and pottery shards containing olive residue. All of this strengthens the suspicion that the cave was indeed used by someone from the western region. The Moroccan research team, led by Dr. Yasmina Kudari, said that this is very rare. We have never found evidence that ancient Middle Eastern civilizations have ever reached this far. But all this evidence really opens up new views, he said. Meanwhile, the Chinese government began to form a special agency to regulate all research and management of the tomb site. They realized that the deeper the excavations were carried out, the more international involvement would occur. So, coordination with UNESCO and World Islamic organizations began to be carried out. Pilgrimage protocols, site protection, and visiting arrangements began to be seriously discussed. The world media also continued to report on this development. On many Middle Eastern television stations, the story of the prophet Zulkifli, which was previously not very well known, was now the main focus. Lectures by great scholars began to raise this story as an example of the struggle of a prophet who was not known to many people, but had a big role. This phenomenon made many people begin to believe that the discovery of this tomb was not a coincidence. Some scholars even called it Allah's way of showing that the truth will always emerge, even if it has to wait thousands of years. However, Islamic leaders continue to remind people not to get caught up in euphoria or fanaticism about the location. The point of all this is to take lessons, not just to be proud. At the same time, there was resistance from extremist groups who felt that this discovery was part of a global engineering to weaken traditional Islamic values. However, their arguments were quickly refuted by emerging scientific evidence, including the testimony of non-Muslim historians who stated that this discovery was valid and verified. Sometime later, another manuscript was found written in a mixture of ancient Persian and local languages. The manuscript explained that a messenger from the West taught patience and not to worship gods. He told us to worship the only God and said that after him would come the last prophet from the Arab nation. This last sentence shocked all researchers. If true, this is an admission that the buried prophet had conveyed a prophecy of the coming of the prophet Muhammad long before the prophethood began. Some scholars say that this could be a meeting point between the history of the prophets and the spiritual geopolitical trajectory of the world. If it is true that a prophet from the children of Israel once lived in China, then the map of world preaching needs to be reviewed. The Islamic world is no longer only centered in the Middle East, but also includes Far Eastern regions such as China and its surroundings. The Chinese government eventually decided to build a special museum to tell the story of the discovery, complete with archaeological evidence, research documentation, and a special space for interfaith understanding. The museum does not impose beliefs, but opens up a dialogue between science and faith. Now the once silent tomb has become a place of spiritual and scientific reflection. Thousands of people come, not just to see the tombstone, but to reflect on the history buried for so long. And from beneath the silent ground, the world is finally beginning to hear the voice of a prophet who had long been forgotten. A voice of patience, sincerity, and a promise to God that he never broke. Following the opening of the special museum and the growing international attention to the tomb believed to be the tomb of a prophet, the Chinese government invited prominent interfaith figures, historians and archaeologists from various countries to attend an open symposium in Beijing. The goal is not just to showcase findings, but to bring together various perspectives in the spirit of scientific collaboration and intercultural understanding. Among the invitees, Dr. Hassan al-Badawi from Egypt, an expert in interpretation who has written dozens of books on the history of the prophets in the Quran, was also present. He attended with his team consisting of philologists, anthropologists, and digital mapping technology scientists. When shown visual recordings of artifacts from caves and ancient manuscripts that had recently been partially translated, Dr. Hassan looked very moved. If this is truly a relic of the prophet Zulkifli, then this is one of the most important discoveries in modern Islamic history, he said. The symposium not only featured presentations, but also became a space for open discussion. There was a long debate about research methodology, data validity, and the universal values of the message conveyed by the prophet. Interestingly, most non-Muslim participants did not question the identity of the prophet, but instead focused on the values of his teachings, which taught patience, justice, and monotheism. A professor from Germany, Dr. Ulrich Meyer, an expert in Far Eastern history, made a surprising comment. He said, if China really was once home to a prophet from the Middle East, then many things in local history need to be reinterpreted. It is possible that some moral aspects of ancient Chinese culture are actually the influence of monotheistic teachings that were not officially recorded. This statement immediately attracted public attention. Many people began to dig up folktales that had previously been considered myths. One of them is the legend of a foreign man who refused to worship the sky and the gods, who lived simply and taught that humans should only worship one god. This story is often mentioned in ancient literature in several regions of China, but has always been considered fiction or ordinary folklore. In fact, there is an ancient manuscript in the ancient library of Dunhuang that tells of a brown-robed sage from the West who came and taught fasting, honesty, and not worshiping idols. Linguists associate this description with the characteristics of the prophets of the children of Israel, including Zulkifli. Meanwhile, outside the scientific forum, a spiritual atmosphere also began to be felt among the people. Many Chinese, both Muslims and non-Muslims, began coming to the tomb area simply to sit quietly, reflect, and reread the stories of the prophets. They did not come to worship, but to seek inner peace. This phenomenon created an unprecedented influx of religious tourism in the country. On the one hand, the Chinese government faced a challenge. They had to balance managing the historical site with religious sensitivity, maintaining security, and respecting the state ideology. However, over time, their approach began to soften. In fact, in an official statement, a spokesperson for the Ministry of Culture stated, "We do not see this as promoting religion, but as part of the historical heritage of humanity that deserves to be respected." Shortly afterward, an international research institute conducted additional excavations on the eastern side of the tomb. There they found artifacts believed to belong to the prophet's followers. There was a note on the stone that read, "We came with him from a distant land. He was never angry, never negligent, and always kept his promises. He taught us patience and surrender to the one God." This writing further strengthens the argument that the prophet did not come alone. He may have brought a small group of followers from his home region. They could be fugitives, wanderers, or secret messengers sent by God to a part of the world untouched by the teachings of monotheism. Archaeologists and historians call them the Zulki community. At the same time, some Muslim researchers began to link this event to classical interpretations. In the old interpretation books, there are indeed records that Zulkifli lived outside the territory of the children of Israel at one stage of his life. There is also an interpretation that mentions that he migrated to a land far from Syria. However, due to the lack of historical data, this interpretation was not raised too much. This provides real support that the possibility of the migration really happened, and the destination was the region of China. Not a few have also begun to compile further research to explore the possibility of the influence of Zulkifli's teachings on Confucian thought or early Taoism philosophy. Although there is no definite conclusion, many concepts such as justice, self-control, and the ethics of simple living feel in harmony. On the last day of the symposium, all participants were invited to visit the tomb site directly. They were asked to wear special clothes, maintain politeness, and not raise their voices. There, the atmosphere was very quiet. Some visitors were seen crying, others were silent in awe. Even non-Muslims claimed to feel a kind of strong, spiritual presence in that place. On the way back, Dr. Hassan wrote in his notes, "This is not just a trip to the tomb of a prophet. This is a journey to explore another side of human history that we have ignored so far. It turns out that revelation can come down in places we do not expect, and the truth is sometimes buried very deep, waiting for the time to rise again." Several months after the International Symposium in Beijing, the echo of the discovery of the prophet's tomb did not subside. In fact, the world's attention was even greater. Global news institutions began to publish in-depth reports, and many religious figures from all over the world wanted to see the site firsthand. However, behind the media spotlight and public excitement, a small team from the International Islamic Research Institute, LRII, chose to move quietly. They were led by Professor Mardani Al-Faruqi, a researcher from Indonesia who is known to be calm and meticulous. Professor Mardani did not come to seek popularity. His main goal was simple: to prove the truth scientifically without letting emotions or sensations interfere with judgment. The team received special permission from the Chinese government to examine the tomb site for 2 full weeks, including parts of the cave and underground tunnels that had not been touched by previous teams. One of the things that caught their attention was the existence of an ancient ventilation system that led directly into the cave. This ventilation was not made carelessly. Its size is uniform, the angle of inclination is precise, and its path follows the direction of the morning sunlight. "This shows that the person who built it had knowledge of engineering and astronomy," said Professor. During the research, they found a hidden chamber that had previously been blocked by a large stone. After carefully opening the entrance, they found a small room with carved walls. There was a mural showing a bearded figure with his hands pointing to the sky, surrounded by a group of people listening. Below it, it was written in the local ancient script. "He came from the west and said that there is only one God." For Professor Mardani, this was like the last piece of the puzzle they had been looking for. He realized that the mission of the prophets was never tied to one region. They could have been sent to faraway places, where they did not even know letters, to convey the message of monotheism. However, from the discovery of the secret room, the team also realized that this tomb was not just a resting place for a prophet. It was the center of a spiritual community in his time. There was a system of residences, prayer rooms, and even places of study around the main cave. The researchers concluded that this prophet led a small community that lived in isolation, perhaps to avoid political or religious pressures at that time. Meanwhile, the Chinese government faced a new dilemma. On the one hand, they did not want the site to become a center of widespread religious activity, given the country's strict rules. On the other hand, they could not stem the flow of local people who came to see and reflect. Some residents even began to call the place the Valley of Truth, because they believed that the people buried there brought upright, just, and compassionate teachings. This phenomenon began to spread to various cities. People began to read the stories of the prophets, both from the Quran and from ancient historical sources. In libraries and bookstores, books about Zulkifli, the prophets of the children of Israel, and the history of monotheism began to sell well. In fact, many young Chinese who were previously not interested in religion are now starting to explore the teachings of monotheism. One of the most viral on social media is the testimony of a young atheist named Yong W. He wrote, "I came to the site just out of curiosity, but when I stood in front of the tomb and read the life story of the person buried there, I felt like I was touched by something invisible. He had no military power, no kingdom, but his teachings still live to this day. Maybe this is what is called the power of truth." Yong W's testimony received millions of likes and was shared around the world. Many netizens from outside China gave positive comments. They said that this was a sign that the world was now thirsting for pure spirituality, not politicized or exploited spirituality. However, amidst all the euphoria, there was also a wave of rejection from certain groups. Some extreme groups considered this discovery as an attempt to Islamize history. They spread a counter-narrative that the site was just the tomb of a local sage, not a prophet. They also accused researchers from the Islamic world of being infiltrators with hidden agendas. In response, Professor simply smiled. "We did not come to change anyone's beliefs. We are just doing research. If our research results are not liked, that is not a problem. But do not let fear get in the way of scientific truth," he told a television station. This calm and scientific attitude is what made Professor Mardani gain a lot of support, even from Chinese academics themselves. A number of local professors who were previously skeptical began to change their minds after seeing the physical evidence and historical records that were revealed transparently. In the closing meeting with officials from the Ministry of Culture, Professor Mardani gave a complete report on the results of his research. He closed his report with one simple sentence. "Sometimes what we consider to be old stories turns out to be historical facts buried by time, and God always has a way to remind humans whenever he wants." With this report, the Chinese government finally decided to designate the site as a historical heritage and spiritual wisdom zone. This status provides strong legal protection, while also allowing for educational activities that are open but still controlled. Today, the site is not only a site for archaeological research, but also a symbol of the intersection of science, history, and the search for the meaning of life. For many, this is not just an ancient tomb, but a door to a new awareness that God can send anyone anywhere to convey his light. Since the prophet's tomb was inaugurated as a historical heritage and spiritual wisdom zone, the flow of visits from abroad has increased drastically. Every day, hundreds of visitors from various backgrounds arrive. Some come as researchers, some come because they are curious, and not a few come because they feel called. However, amid the crowd of visitors and the international spotlight, there is one thing that has begun to attract the attention of archaeologists and ancient language researchers. When Professor Mardani's team was tidying up the final report and rescanning the rock structure around the old tunnel, they accidentally discovered a small hidden passage behind one of the rock walls. The passage was covered by a flat stone slab that looked like a natural part of the cave. It took 2 days to carefully open it, because there was a concern that it would damage the structure inside. Once successfully opened, the passage led them to an underground room that was completely different from the other areas. The carvings were finer, the temperature was cooler, and the walls were inscribed with symbols and writings that had never been seen before in the study of the site. After cleaning it, they realized that this was some kind of archive or private room. In the center of the room was a small, waist-high stone box, on top of which was a thin metal container. When the container was opened, they found a leather scroll that appeared to be from a very ancient time. The writing on it was very neat, using black and red ink. Some words looked familiar in the ancient Semitic script, which was then matched by a team of experts from Egypt and Syria. The initial results were surprising. The scroll contained fragments of prayers, instructions for worship, and moral messages that were very close to Islamic values. Although written long before the arrival of the Prophet Muhammad, one of the most exciting parts was the passage that read, "There will come a man born from the desert, bringing revelation from heaven, perfecting the way of our brothers who were sent before." This sentence is considered by some researchers to be a very clear prophecy of the coming of the final messenger. Some have compared the contents of this writing to similar prophecies that were once found in the Dead Sea and the Qumran scrolls, which have long been believed to have come from the Essenes. The Chinese government immediately secured the room and formed a special cross-country team to verify the authenticity of the manuscript. The process was rigorous, using modern technology such as carbon dating, spectrographic scanning of ink, and testing of leather materials. Initial results from laboratory tests showed that the manuscript was indeed very old, possibly dating back 100,000 years before Christ. This finding not only confirmed that the tomb belonged to a prophet from ancient times, but also opened up a new discourse on the relationship between prophets and the unification of the teachings of monotheism from time to time. In a limited conference, Professor Mardani explained, "This is proof that the messages of the prophets do not contradict each other. They carry one message, only different times and places. And now from a place as far away as China, we see the fragments of history coming together again. However, along with the popularity of the new discovery, another wave of reaction emerged from Western academics and politicians. Some accused the narrative of the last prophet's prophecy of being too favorable to Islam. They urged that religious interpretation be limited and the study process be returned entirely to the realm of archaeology and history. In response, the Chinese government remained neutral. They did not mention the name of a specific prophet in the official announcement, but continued to convey that the artifact contained universal spiritual values that taught the oneness of God and peace among humans. This attitude was welcomed by the public, although it still raised many questions. The tomb site began to receive special visits from world figures. Among them were a great cleric from North Africa, an Orthodox Christian priest from Ethiopia, and even a liberal Jewish rabbi from the United States. They all came not to claim, but to witness firsthand and have a dialogue. One of the most historic meetings occurred when the three stood together in front of the tomb, then prayed in their own way while delivering a message of peace in front of the media. This moment went viral and was called Eastern Wall Prayer Day. The media called it a symbol that people from different backgrounds can unite when they face something bigger than just their identities, namely truth and the search for the meaning of life. Meanwhile, among the general public, spiritual stories began to emerge. Some visitors claimed to have had strange dreams after visiting the tomb. Some dreamed of meeting an old man with a beard who only said one sentence, "Your God is one, so do not divide him." Although these stories are difficult to verify scientifically, they further strengthen the spiritual aura of the site. On the other hand, discussion movements and small communities emerged in large Chinese cities. They began to re-examine the spiritual history of their ancestors, even starting conversations about the concept of divinity in modern life. Some called this a new wave of spiritual awareness in the East. At the end of the second phase of research, Professor Mardani made an important note in his report. Buried in the Silent Valley is not only the body of a prophet, but also a message that has been forgotten by the world, that humans must return to the basic values of creation, worshiping the One, acting justly, and living in peace. Although the world has begun to pay serious attention to the tomb sites of the prophet found around the Great Wall of China, one thing has not been resolved. Who exactly is the prophet buried there? This question is hanging in the minds of everyone. Archaeologists, theologians, and historians from various countries have begun to compile possibilities based on ancient texts, geographical analysis, and historical records. A team from Turkey even brought an Ottoman manuscript that mentions a prophet from the Far East who lived between two mountains near the land of the great king. Although the description is still vague, some have linked it to the story of Zulkarnain, a figure mentioned in the Quran as a great leader who once built a protective wall from destructive creatures called Ya'juj and Magog. However, this hypothesis is still too far-fetched. There is no hard evidence that the person buried at the site is Zulkarnain, so researchers tried a more cautious approach. They compiled a list of prophets known in the history of the monotheistic religions, especially those related to the Eastern or non-Arab regions. In the process, one name emerged that slowly began to be mentioned: the prophet Khidr. This figure is very mysterious. In Islamic tradition, Khidr is known as a servant of Allah who was given knowledge directly from him. A person who is never directly mentioned as a prophet in the Quran, but clearly has a very high status in the sight of Allah. He once met the prophet Moses in a unique story, showing actions that cannot be understood by ordinary logic, but all have deep wisdom. Several ancient texts from the Middle East mention that Khidr had close ties with areas far to the east. In some Sufi traditions, it is even mentioned that Khidr could be present in various places at different times, as if he was not bound by space and time. This makes his identity even more mysterious. However, back to the tomb, experts gathered more clues. One of the stone panels in the previously discovered crypt has a picture of a river flowing under two mountains. On it is written in ancient script, a kind of poetry. He came from the west to the east. He did not die because of age, but because of God's command. He stayed to wait for time, but time has chosen to end him. This sentence made the discussion even more heated. Some believe it refers to a figure who was immortalized by God for a long task, then died after his task was completed. Is this a reference to Khidr or to another prophet? As the debate rages, the Chinese government has allowed the opening of the lower part of the tomb for the first time. Until now, only the outer area and the central room have been open to the public and for research. The lower part of the tomb is believed to be the inner chamber, where the body's laid out. The opening was carried out very carefully, with scientific and spiritual protocols. The Chinese team worked with Muslim researchers from Egypt, Turkey, and Indonesia. They first purified the place, then opened the inner chamber by reciting prayers in 3 languages: Arabic, Mandarin, and English. Once the hidden old iron door was opened, the small room appeared very simple, not luxurious, not magnificent. In the middle was a block of white stone at an angle, as if symbolizing a long sleep. On the side of the stone was a piece of cloth that was starting to crumble, but had gold embroidery with the ancient Arabic phrase, La ilaha illallah. Everyone was silent. There was no sound, only gasps of awe and disbelief. An Indonesian religious figure who witnessed the opening only whispered softly, Subhanallah. This is not just a tomb. This is a place that holds the light of the times. The Chinese government then issued an official statement that this site would be used as a center for interfaith civilization. They called it the Eastern Wall Peace Center. This center will be a place for research, a place of worship for interfaith, and a spiritual museum that promotes the values of monotheism, wisdom, and peace.